Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this Talkback Thursday conversation. My name is Christina Gaines, and I'm the Campus and Community Programs Manager here at the Goose Performing Arts Center. I'm thrilled to introduce our special guest, Dr. Chase Bringardner, who's the Department Chair and Professor in the Department of Theater and Dance at Auburn University. Welcome, Chase. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So today we're going to discuss the Department of Theater and Dance's upcoming production of Into the Woods, a staged concert, which will be performed at the Goose Center on March 4th, 5th, and 6th. We are excited to have that here at GPAC. So I'm just going to jump right in then. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that this production will be the first collaboration between the Department of Theater and Dance, the Department of Music, and the J. and Susie Goose Performing Arts Center. Can you tell us how this partnership came about?
Sure. So typically speaking, in any given year, we as a Department of Theater and Dance do roughly about 2 musicals, one that's sort of a smaller musical and one that's a larger musical. And in those musicals, we typically do have some form of a collaboration with the music department, but it's oftentimes on a much smaller scale. Mm-hmm. This is providing us an opportunity to be sort of very much involved with the music department and the GPAC on a larger scale, larger than we've probably ever done before. So we're really excited about this particular opportunity to kind of start a new, hopefully, chapter in that collaboration, in which we're sort of producing this bigger musical with a bigger orchestra involving both faculty, students, and staff from both the music and the theater department, and the Goose Center staff as well, to kind of put on this much larger production than we're sort of used to in terms of that kind of space, with a full orchestra, full, cast of nearly 20 people. And so we're really hopeful that this is something that sort of launches future collaborations moving forward.
Absolutely. All the bells and whistles. Be fun.
Indeed, yes. Exactly.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear more about the inspiration and the creative side of things. I understand that this is a staged concert. Can you explain what the audience can expect to see?
Sure. I think in terms of stage concert, a lot of this will be the first time for us in the theater and dance department sort of producing outside of our own spaces in our building in, perhaps ever since I've been here. So about 13 years. So it's been a while that we've had occasionally a dance concert or two that's done sort of found spaces or sort of using the museum, for example. But in terms of a full-blown production, this is sort of a first for us. So I think we wanted to make sure that we were sort of setting expectations about what that, the performance would be. And really what it means by a stage concert is that the orchestra is going to be sort of showcased right alongside the performers, and, all of the set, the lights, the costumes, etc. So the orchestra will actually be on stage. They won't be down in the pit. So you'll be able to see the orchestra as you sort of see the performers. But it is the full show. It is not just sort of a series of songs from the show. It is the full show with all of the dialogue from the very beginning to the very end, with everyone in costume, and all the dialogue in between. So the stage concert is really just referencing the fact that the orchestra is going to be on stage, and that we put extra attention, I guess you could say, into the vocal prep for the actors, for the performers, and for those orchestra rehearsals. So really as an attempt to really showcase the best of what the theater and dance department and the music department can do when they can collaborate together.
Amazing. That's very cool. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but so Into the Woods is a very popular musical and one that's often performed. Mm-hmm. Other than the orchestra being on stage, how are you putting your own spin on this production?
Well, this is actually a fascinating story. So I have a very long history with this musical, as does the Department of Theater and Dance. When I first arrived here, as I said, a little over 13 years ago, this was one of the first productions that the department did when I arrived. And as a young visiting professor at that point in time, I wasn't yet even on the tenure track yet. I had said, oh, if you need, an extra performer, we had just sort of started our musical theater program at that point in time. And we were sort of low on male identified performers, which is sometimes a challenge. So I had volunteered myself to be perhaps in it if they needed an extra person, and found myself cast in the show as a first-year person. So I played the baker in that production about 13 years ago. And so it's a really surreal, exciting, strange, but also incredibly rewarding opportunity to kind of return to this musical that has meant a lot to our department. That original production was directed by Dan LaRock, who has since retired a couple years ago, was a really important figure both in the theater and dance department, but certainly across the campus at Auburn. And so it does feel very heightened, I guess, to kind of come at this production now as a director, not being in it, and to cast and sort of direct a whole new group of sort of students through this process. And, you know, I'm now also 13 years older. So it is one of those musicals, you sort of reference it being a really popular musical. And I think it is kind of one of the few musicals in sort of the musical theater canon, I think, that really can speak to any particular time or moment that you're in. Right. It talks a lot about sort of giants and wolves and sort of these forces that are sort of perhaps causing some fear outside of sort of the general sort of world in which we live. And I think that each generation, each decade perhaps has its own sort of sense of what those things are. So it's one of those musicals that when you come back to it, it really allows you to think through it in a completely different way and allows you to really think about the current moment that you're in a really different way. And I would be, I have to mention, I think, too, that back in November, we lost Stephen Sondheim, sort of the composer lyricist of this musical. And just based upon the sort of flurry of outpourings of grief through social media, one of the primary texts that people were quoting a fair amount in terms of trying to process that grief was in fact Into the Woods. So this is one of my first engagement, obviously, to return to Sondheim post his passing. But I think that there's been a sort of collective outpouring nationwide of different kinds of productions of Sondheim's work to kind of mark this really kind of important moment. I mean, I think it's not sort of underselling it to say that Sondheim is to sort of this contemporary moment of theater, kind of what Shakespeare was to sort of, Elizabethan or Renaissance, England. So that sort of sense of the importance and what that legacy is now and will continue to be, I think can't be sort of undersold. So it's a real privilege to come back and revisit this text with these particular students, having had those sort of past experiences in this past 13 years, really making this particular production reflect things in a different way. I think the other thing about the musical is that it deals a lot with the relationships between sort of the younger generation and the older generation. And, having now gone 13 years through that process of going from more on the younger generation side to perhaps the middle-aged, going to the older generation side, I feel like I picked up a lot more things out of this musical in terms of the depth of the lyrics, in terms of the content and the meaning that I didn't have before when I was right out of graduate school here and sort of performing on stage. Now it resonates in a different way, and different moments feel weightier to me than they did previously.
I agree. I've seen this musical a few times, and I think what attracted me the most was the whimsical fairy tale elements of it, because I love that. But the more I see it, the more profound situations and scenes become, and lyrics, as you said. So really looking forward to how that translates in your production.
Yeah, so, sure. I mean, it has all of these little, sorry to interrupt there, but it has all these little nuggets, right? That you sort of like, you pull out. I think the one that we sort of used within our marketing brochure for our season this year was, isn't it nice to know a lot and a little bit not? Mm-hmm. So it's all of these things that sort of are like these truisms that sort of speak to the original sort of notion of those fairy tales as something that are instructive and that teach us something. But then it puts this very sort of like modern, I think, spin on them to kind of update them for our contemporary moment.
Yes, I agree with that completely. So I'd like to visit the student involvement in this production. What or how are students involved beyond just what we see on the stage?
It's a great question. As within any other productions that we do here in the Department of Theater and Dance, students are involved at every level. So that's not just in terms of being performers, but we're talking about in terms of design, in terms of sort of the executions of those designs in the costume and the prop shops and the scene shops. There'll be students sort of in and out of your building all next week as we get stuff ready to go. We have a student sound designer on this production, which, as you might know, for a musical is a huge task, because not only are they sort of dealing with sort of any of the sort of sounds of, giant footsteps and leaves rustling and those kinds of things, but they're also dealing with all of the miking of all of the cast members and balancing that sound with the sound of the orchestra, so everyone can be heard, and you can hear all of those wonderful lyrics that we were talking about earlier. But that student is being actually mentored by a professional sound engineer and sound designer that we've worked with before, but they are taking lead on this. So this is their first big lead project. So we have, students are involved on every single level, and that's a really important part, because this production, much like all of the productions in our department and those that are in the Department of Music, are outgrowths of the classroom. So they are sort of pedagogical in their mission and in kind of putting the students into real world situations to test out what they've learned, and to build their resumes for future experience.
Great. That's very exciting. I love to hear that. For all of you just joining in, I'm live with Dr. Chase Bringardner, Chair and Professor in the Department of Theater and Dance. We are discussing the upcoming production of Into the Woods, a staged concert, which will take place at the Goose Center March 4th, 5th, and 6th. Tickets are still available on the theater department's website. So I'd like to continue talking about the students. I imagine that scheduling rehearsals has been quite the challenge, especially between two departments. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And I would say, even to compound onto those challenges, coming out of this sort of moment of, or still, I guess, being in part in this moment of COVID and pandemic, it's been a time in which a lot of conversations have been happening industry-wide about kind of what those rehearsal processes are like, and sort of the use of time, and sort of, particularly when you're talking about student performers, you're talking about people who are engaged in coursework all day, not just within the theater and dance department or the music department, but across campus, right? They're here as a student, right, but they're also here to learn and engage in the performance process. So balancing out that sort of really complicated scheduling puzzle, which is not unlike, say, a student athlete on campus, can be a challenge. And I think one of the things that we really committed to as a department coming out of this pandemic moment was that we wanted to reflect the changes that were happening in our larger industry, which were really taking into account some practices that have been in place that sort of maybe privileged product over process a little bit, and that had sort of made it not as easy to sustain a life or a career as a performer, leading to a lot of burnout. And so in reflection and, as a department, we decided to limit actually our number of rehearsals that we have in a week. We used to do 6, and we limited that down to 5. And we sort of changed up the way in which we've done our tech process a little bit to eliminate some of the longer chunks of time that we used to sort of spend there without proper breaks. So that has meant that instead of the 6 days of rehearsal, we've had 5 in a week, going Sunday through Thursday. But I think ultimately, this is the first production that I've worked on that's had that as a practice. And one of the things I think that's been really beneficial about it is that the students have been more rested in some ways. They've been able to sort of have a reset on the weekends a little bit. And I think it's actually made the process a better process because they come more engaged to the work that they're doing. So we started rehearsals right after the beginning of the semester and have been in rehearsal since sort of that mid-January period, doing in that 5 days a week. And we've been rehearsing in our space. The orchestra has had a number of rehearsals with our music director in their own space. And so we'll all be kind of coming together for the first time, the orchestra and the performers, this coming Sunday for what's called a sits probe, in which we'll sing through it the first time with all of the performers and the orchestra together. So we're looking forward to that, putting all of these sort of pieces together, for sure.
That's exciting. I can imagine the challenges of those schedules.
It's a lot. Well, I mean, those are all, like, you think about course schedules, and everyone has their own unique course schedule. And when you're dealing with close to 20 performers, and then to add on top of that, all of the management team that is also involved with that. And then when you're getting into the tech process, all of the design team, it gets to be a lot of schedules. We're very thankful to have wonderful managers that help us do all of that. So
for sure. I love that you brought rehearsals down to just 5 days, because burnout is real, as you said. I hear that a lot in the field, especially after COVID, and just kind of in this weird limbo, hopefully coming out of it, fingers crossed, where a lot of colleagues, friends are, talking about burnout, talking about how stressed they are. And I think a lot of people too are really excited to get back into the theater and get back seeing live performances. And that virtual things are kind of not becoming a thing of the past, but not as frequent as we were seeing them.
Sure. And I think people have that kind of screen fatigue.
Yes.
There's a lot to be said for liveness, I think, and for sharing space. And I think if there's anything perhaps that COVID has sort of led us to, to care deeply about, it is that ability to share physical space with other people in a way that is safe. But, I think that is what live theater, I think, does best, right? Is to have us kind of come into a space together to feel that energy that exists within the audience, the energy that's being sort of transferred between the audience and those performers and those musicians on stage, that kind of thing that's created in that moment for only that moment in time, is something that's really, really special, that in the virtual space, it's just different. Yeah. It's not necessarily worse. It works well for many things, but I think for why many of us got into it in the first place, it is that sort of sense of that liveness and that connection that comes of being in a space together.
Yes. Yes, I agree. So I'd like to talk about you as the director. What has the creative process been like for you?
Well, as I sort of mentioned before, I mean, this is probably one of the most surreal creative processes that I've ever been involved in, because I know the show really well. I was in it. I was an actor in it, as I said, performing the role of the baker. So that's been really kind of interesting to kind of have these moments in rehearsal where I'm like flashing back to Dan LaRock, like directing me and sort of helping me to develop a character that I'm now helping a student, Holden Matheson, who's a senior in our department, develop that character of the baker. So he's been very generous and very gracious with me, sort of having these moments of, oh my gosh, what's going on here, right? Or like where I've been having these kind of oddly sentimental moments in the middle of rehearsal where normally that would not necessarily be the case. So I think for me, coming out of the sort of, hopefully, knock on wood, this COVID moment, and sort of having this be the first time that we're collaborating, in this way at the Goose Center, it's overwhelming in a lot of ways. But I think one of the things that has been really useful about this production, particularly in doing Into the Woods, is that it's really a musical about taking risks and about sort of taking risks through finding your community that is going to help support you through the tough times. So in essence, it's kind of like it provides you within the musical kind of structures that help support you through the putting on of the musical, right? So it has the songs about, reminding you of things like children will listen. So like, you better watch the energy that you bring into the rehearsal room because you have students that are in front of you that you're working with, right? But also, that idea of going into the woods and sort of, that you have to go to take that risk, to take that step to achieve, success, or to achieve, something for the future, to make something better. You have to take that risk, and that you take that risk not alone, but as a community. And so I think it's been in many ways through this process kind of a perfect experience to kind of come back to the fullness of live theater, because the kind of the fears and the trepidation that many of us are feeling as we do that, trying to figure out if we remember how to do this stuff that we did, 2 or 3 years ago, we're kind of like getting the rust off. But the musical itself helps us in that sense, because it is anticipating those fears and providing really lovely, hummable music to sort of help us process those fears. So I've really looked to the musical in many ways as a way to help me in those moments of uncertainty or doubt for myself. And it's also just been really great, I think, through this particular process to see these particular students come to life and really embracing these lyrics and the meanings of these lyrics. I mean, it's in essence such a perfect musical to do within an academic environment, particularly like within, a college or university environment, because these are not simple lyrics, right? They take a certain level of sophistication and understanding of the dual and triple and quadruple meanings that many of these phrases have. And it really does rely on these students to embrace the fullness of the educational experience that they're having here, to be able to sort of tap into those deeper levels. And I will say it's been really gratifying to see those students succeed in reaching that depth.
That's amazing. So important after the past few years that we've had, for them to connect to something that way. That'll be lovely to see. So speaking of the students, I'm going to come back around to them right now. Why is it so important for students to have opportunities to perform at places like the Goose Center?
That's a great question. And, it's such a wonderful opportunity for students across campus to be able to engage with the Goose Center in all sorts of ways, right? As audience members, as performers, as staff, as whatever, all the different ways that they can engage, because it is a direct way in which the work and the sort of learning that they're doing in classrooms and in department buildings across campus translates directly into sort of more real world practical experience. And for our students, many of them, will go on to perform in venues like the GPAC. And I think it's a really important thing to kind of think about for them, that they have that experience of being on a stage like the stage at the Goose Center, having that experience too of moving from one space like our own space to another. Our students get a little bit, I think, let's say they're very lucky that within our space, we oftentimes can do rehearsals for our shows in the same space that they're performing. And in the real world, that doesn't often happen, right? Because the space where they're performing is booked with multiple shows, right? And so they're rehearsing in an offsite space and then moving into that performance space. And so this is really one of the first times since I've been here where that's been the case, where we've rehearsed in not one, but two different spaces, and will now be moving into a third space. And that is such an important learning experience for those students to have, to kind of gear up for that move, have that additional sort of extra burst of kind of creative, nervous energy of getting into a new space and feeling that excitement. I think it also just sort of gets us out of our own building and gets us into more of a different place on campus that sort of taps into different kinds of audiences as well. But yeah, it's for our students, and I've heard this numerous times throughout this process where they're like, we're getting to perform on the same stage that Sutton Foster performed on, right? And for them, that's like, that's incredible. And that's not even something that like 5 years ago we could say.
Right.
So I think it's incredible to think about the growth of this artistic community total, right, in terms of the Auburn Opelika area and what the Goose Center has sort of meant, not only for our community writ large, but particularly for the arts departments on campus, and kind of what is possible now through the presence of a space like this that before just wasn't in our imagination. And now for these students, there's a whole lot more dreaming and a whole lot more possibility that is now available to them than what was before.
Absolutely. I was a student in the music department back in the day, and way before the Goose Center. And I remember, me with my peers sitting around dreaming of how amazing it would be to have a performing arts center, or to have artists come into Auburn, and not ever thinking that it would happen, or, maybe not even in our lifetimes, but how amazing that possibility could be. And here it is. And it's just really surreal and amazing to see. And we were so hungry for it, and now it's here. And I think it's done wonders for campus as well as the community, and even Alabama.
100%.
Yeah, it's great. So what's next for the Department of Theater after Into the Woods?
Yeah, so after Into the Woods, we'll have one more show within our season, which is going to be taking place in our Black Box space, which is a production called The Wolves, which follows a sort of a season in the life of a high school girls soccer team. It's been a really popular play that was sort of originally done off Broadway and has been performed regionally throughout the country, and has been done at a lot of colleges and universities. If you're a fan of soccer in any way, there's like actual soccer drills in the performance and in the production. But it does kind of give you a nice kind of glimpse into the lives of sort of like the true gritty lives of sort of high school girls in a way that oftentimes is not presented on stages. And I think it's funny, it's poignant, it's intimate. It's down in our Black Box space, which is a very different space than the Goose Performing Arts Center. The giant space of the Goose down to sort of the very I guess tight knit, as I said, intimate space of the Black Box. And that will close out our season for this year. But then we're already looking forward to and in the planning stages for next season, which we'll announce in the initial stages sometime in sort of mid to late April.
Amazing. Well, we look forward to that. It went quick. I remember when you announced your season, and now here we are, almost at the end.
I know. I think in this time of COVID and coming out of COVID, time seems like a very relative concept.
Yes, time is strange on many levels. Well, friends, I believe that's all the time we have for today. Chase, thank you so much for joining us and being so generous with your time. We are looking forward to the performances of Into the Woods.
Thank you. Yeah, it was wonderful to speak with you, and I'm happy to do so anytime.
Great. We'll definitely have you back. So you can see Into the Woods, a staged concert at the Goose Performing Arts Center on March 4th and 5th at 7:30 p.m. and March 6th. There is a matinee performance at 2:30 p.m. This is a fantastic opportunity to see the collaboration between the Department of Theater and Dance and the Department of Music at Auburn University. Tickets are still available on the Department of Theater and Dance's website at theatertickets.auburn.edu. And join us again next Thursday, March 3rd at 1 o'clock p.m. for another live episode in GPAC's Talkback Thursday series. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.